He brought his new partner to the mediation to make her flinch, but Emily had already learned how to sit still in a storm. The conference room was all glass and polished wood, cold enough to make every reflection look sharper than the person standing in it. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if you believe dignity is the strongest revenge, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to her story. Jason walked in first, wearing that same expensive confidence that used to fool everyone into calling him charming. Beside him was the woman he had chosen after 11 years of marriage, smiling too brightly, clutching her designer bag like she had already won something. Emily did not move when she saw them. She kept her hands folded on the legal pad in front of her, the simple gold ring she still wore catching a thin stripe of morning light from the window. Not because she wanted him back, because she had not yet decided what kind of woman she would be when this was over. Across the table, the mediator cleared her throat and began with the usual polite voice, the one people used when they knew a room was carrying old damage. Assets, custody, property division. The language of endings, spoken in calm sentences. Jason leaned back in his chair, the corner of his mouth lifting as if he had arrived with a performance prepared just for her. He made a small, dismissive gesture toward Emily, then toward the woman beside him, as if introducing a prize he had upgraded to. "I just want everything handled fairly," he said, and the words were so smooth they almost sounded sincere. Almost. The new partner smiled without looking at Emily, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who had been told she was the better choice. Emily glanced down at the papers in front of her. Years ago, these pages would have terrified her. Back when she was the one who stayed late to balance the household budget, who tracked every bill, every school form, every repair, every compromise. Back when Jason praised her for being organized, practical, dependable, the kind of woman men like him often mistake for someone who will never leave. But that woman was gone now. In her place sat someone who knew exactly how much silence could cost. The room hummed with the soft buzz of the air conditioner and the faint scratch of pen on paper. Jason kept talking, filling the space with polished little lies, and Emily let him. She listened the way people listen to weather reports before a hurricane. Then she reached into her folder and placed one document on the table, gently, carefully, like setting down a key. Jason's eyes flicked to it, then narrowed. It was only the first page. He had no idea what was buried beneath it. Jason had settled into the kind of confidence that only appeared when a man believed the room belonged to him. He drummed his fingers once against the polished table, then leaned back in his chair with a look that was almost bored. Across from him, Emily remained still, her hands folded lightly over the folder in front of her. The air in the mediation office carried the scent of paper, coffee, and expensive cologne that lingered too long on Jason's jacket. He kept speaking to his attorney in a low, controlled voice, saying enough to sound reasonable and nothing that actually sounded honest. The woman beside him, his new partner, wore a bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. She touched his arm whenever she wanted to be seen touching it, as if affection could be staged into proof. Emily watched the performance without flinching. A year ago, that smile would have felt like a slap. Today it looked small. Her gaze drifted to the documents in front of her. Tax filings, account summaries, business records, the quiet paper trail of a life she had spent months rebuilding in private. When Jason first left, he had assumed she would be too shaken to think clearly, too wounded to ask questions. He had mistaken her silence for surrender. He had no idea that silence had become her working language. It had begun with small things. A bookkeeping course taken at night after work. A financial workshop on Saturdays. Long evenings spent at the kitchen table while the apartment outside her window went dark one floor at a time. She had learned how assets moved, how liabilities hid, how names could be placed on paper in ways that looked innocent until someone read every line. The woman Jason used to call careful, practical, predictable had not disappeared. She had sharpened. Now she knew where every number lived. She knew who had signed what, when, and why. She knew which email threads mattered and which promises had been recorded in ways Jason never bothered to notice. His attorney was speaking now, in that smooth voice lawyers used when they wanted a lie to sound like a compromise. Emily lowered her eyes to the first page she had already placed on the table. Jason followed her gaze, still wearing that smug expression, as if he expected her to crack under the weight of memory. But the document beneath her fingertips was only a door. Behind it sat months of records, corrections, and one very careful order of events. She had arranged everything with the patience of someone setting a table for a meal she knew her enemies would not finish. Jason's new partner said something softly, trying to sound supportive, but Emily barely heard her. The room had grown very quiet. Even the air conditioner seemed to hum more softly, as if it understood that something had shifted. Emily looked up at Jason at last, and there was no anger in her face, no pleading, no tremor. Only a clear, measured calm that made his smile falter by a fraction. He did not like that look. He remembered her best in tears, in apologies, in the version of herself that once made space for his moods. This version had no room for him. She reached into the folder again and slid a second page forward, then a third. Jason's attention changed at once. His eyes moved faster now, skimming the headings, the dates, the figures. A crease formed between his brows. Emily did not rush him. Let him read. Let him sit with the shape of his own mistake. The mediation table between them was narrow, but it suddenly felt like a long distance. On the far side of the glass wall, sunlight moved across the hallway in pale gold strips. Somewhere outside, a door opened and closed. Inside, Jason's partner adjusted her posture, sensing the change before she understood it. Emily rested one hand on the edge of the folder and spoke with a voice so even it was almost gentle. "You brought the wrong person here," she said. Jason looked up, and for the first time since he walked in, something uncertain crossed his face. That was when Emily opened the folder all the way and placed the final set of papers on the table, each one marked, signed, and ready. The room had not yet reacted. No one had spoken, but the first crack in his certainty was already there, and she intended to widen it. Jason read the final set of papers twice, then a third time, as if the ink might rearrange itself under the weight of his disbelief. The silence in the mediation room deepened, stretching between the soft tick of the wall clock and the faint rustle of pages in his hands. Emily did not move. She kept her posture calm, her shoulders relaxed, her fingers resting lightly on the folder as though this were a routine meeting and not the moment his certainty began to fracture. Beside him, his new partner had gone still, her earlier confidence thinning into something sharper and less comfortable. She glanced from Jason to the documents, then back again, her smile fading at the edges. Across the polished table, Emily looked almost distant, but there was nothing absent in her attention. She was watching everything. The way Jason's jaw tightened. The way his thumb pressed hard against the corner of the page. The way the room itself seemed to shrink as the numbers and signatures settled into place. He had expected her to arrive shaken, maybe even pleading. Instead, she had come prepared, measured, and utterly unafraid. He let out a small laugh, but it lacked conviction. "This cannot be right," he said, though his voice had lost the ease he wore when he first entered. Emily tilted her head slightly. "It is right," she replied. Her tone was not sharp. That was what made it worse. No anger, no trembling, just certainty. Jason looked down again, scanning the headings with a visible effort to understand what he was seeing. The mediation agreement, the property disclosures, the revised financial statement, the attached record of accounts he had never expected her to obtain. Each page carried the quiet weight of order, of preparation, of a life he no longer controlled. The papers did not shout. They did not need to. They sat there like sealed doors. His partner shifted in her chair, one hand smoothing her skirt as her gaze settled on the line item near the bottom of the page. Her face changed first. Then Jason saw it too. The clause. The one he had missed. Emily had not only protected what was hers. She had turned his own assumptions into a trap he had walked into smiling. A fine sheen of sweat appeared at his temple despite the cool air in the room. He set the papers down, then picked them up again, as though a second look might create a different answer. "You did all this before we got here," he said quietly. Emily finally allowed herself the smallest breath, almost a smile, but not enough to call it one. "Long before today," she said. The mediator cleared his throat softly, aware that the balance in the room had changed and would not return to what it had been. Jason leaned forward now, but the movement no longer carried power. It carried concern, the kind of concern that arrives too late. Emily opened her folder one final time and slid a single page across the table. "You wanted a reaction," she said. "You brought an audience. But what you really brought here was proof. Jason stared at the page, then at her, and for the first time since the marriage ended, he looked like a man realizing the door had already closed behind him. Outside the glass wall, sunlight moved across the hallway, bright and indifferent. Inside, Emily folded her hands together and waited, because some victories did not require raised voices. They only required perfect timing. The mediator's pen hovered over the notepad, but no one in the room was really looking at the notepad anymore. Jason kept staring at the page Emily had slid across the table, as if it might rewrite itself if he stared long enough. The calm in the room had changed shape. It was no longer the brittle quiet of tension. It was the kind of silence that follows a decision already made. Emily sat with her hands loosely folded, her back straight, her expression unreadable under the soft wash of daylight coming through the glass wall. The downtown office looked polished and expensive in that familiar corporate way, all pale stone, brushed steel, and a long conference table that reflected every small movement like a secret it had no intention of keeping. Jason had brought his new partner here to watch Emily break. He had wanted the room to tilt in his favor. Instead, it had gone still around her. The woman beside him shifted first. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag, and then she glanced at Jason with the faint impatience of someone who was beginning to understand that the performance she had been promised was not arriving on schedule. Jason swallowed, then looked down again at the documents. There were signatures, dates, financial schedules, a division of assets so precise it felt less like negotiation and more like a ledger settled by someone who had already done the math twice. He had expected arguments, tears, a flash of anger, maybe even a mistake. What he found instead was structure, proof, patience. Emily had built this moment the same way she had built the life no one here had bothered to notice. Slowly, carefully, without applause, the mediator cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. His voice, when it came, was careful and professional. Mr. Harlan, these provisions were filed according to the amended disclosures. Jason looked up sharply. Amended disclosures? Emily did not answer right away. She let the question hang there, clean and exposed, before she opened the folder again and placed another page on top of the others. The first set was incomplete, she said evenly. You signed it before the missing accounts were fully identified. Jason's face changed in a way she remembered too well. Not with rage, with the first small crack of fear. The kind that enters a man when he realizes the room is no longer performing for him. His partner frowned and leaned closer to the papers. Emily saw the exact moment the woman understood what Jason had not. These were not emotional claims. They were facts, accounts, transfers, ownership records. The language of a life rebuilt with enough discipline to survive being underestimated. Outside, a horn sounded faintly from the street below, distant and ordinary. Inside, the air felt sharpened by each breath. Emily turned one page with deliberate calm. You wanted to bring her here to make me feel small, she said, her voice quiet enough to force everyone to listen. But you forgot something. Jason's jaw tightened. And what is that? She met his eyes without blinking. I stopped asking for permission a long time ago. The words settled in the room like velvet over steel. His partner looked away first. The mediator lowered his gaze to the documents. Jason remained frozen, not because he had no response, but because every response he could imagine would only reveal how little control he still had. Emily gathered the pages back into alignment, tapping the stack once against the table until every edge was perfectly flush. It was such a small gesture, almost polite, yet it carried the weight of finality. She had not come here to beg, and she had not come here to prove she was worthy of anything. She had come prepared, and preparation, she had learned, was often the quietest form of power. Jason stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if the woman across from him had stepped out of the marriage years ago and left behind a stranger who now held all the terms. Emily closed the folder. Let us continue, she said, and for the first time that day, it was Jason who looked like the one being summoned. The room stayed silent, but the balance had already shifted, and there was no going back. The moment the mediator said, "We can move to the final agreement," Jason leaned back in his chair as if the room had finally remembered its proper order. He had changed into that polished kind of smugness men wore when they believed the worst was already behind them. His new partner sat beside him with a careful smile, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, her perfume too bright for the small, airless conference room. Emily did not look at either of them. She sat with one hand over the folder in front of her, her posture calm, her expression controlled, as sunlight from the tall window drew a pale line across the polished wood. The mediator cleared his throat and reached for the next page. Before we proceed, there is one additional matter to address. Jason frowned. What additional matter? Emily opened the folder slowly, not because she needed time, but because she understood the value of timing. Inside were the documents Jason had ignored, the ones he had treated like paperwork, the ones he had dismissed because he had been too confident to read them closely. She slid a single sheet forward, then another, then the final page, each one marked with the kind of precision that made care impossible to dismiss. The mediator read first, his eyes moving once, then again. His face changed in small increments, as if the truth was arriving in stages he had not been prepared for. Jason noticed. He leaned in. "What is that?" he asked, but Emily still did not answer him directly. Across from her, his partner's smile thinned. She glanced down at the page, then at Jason, then back again, as if trying to find the version of the room where this still worked in his favor. There was no such version. Emily placed her fingertips on the top edge of the stack and tapped it once, a quiet sound that seemed to settle everything. The mediator looked up. This indicates that the marital home, certain investment accounts, and the business holdings listed here were transferred under terms Mr. Carter did not review in full. Jason's mouth parted slightly. He gave a short laugh that never became real. That is not possible. Emily finally looked at him. Her eyes were steady, not cruel, not emotional, just clear. It is very possible, she said. You sign before you read. The room went so still that even the air felt suspended. Jason reached for the documents, but the mediator drew them back just enough to keep the pages in place. The agreements were validly executed, he said, and the language is unambiguous. Jason blinked once, then again, as if clarity itself had become offensive. Emily, he said, and for the first time, there was something thin and uncertain in his voice. You planned this. She did not smile. No, she said. I prepared for it. That was the difference he had never understood. He had spent years assuming silence meant surrender. He had mistaken restraint for weakness. Now he sat in a room he had wanted to control, watching the ground move beneath him while she remained perfectly still. The partner beside him shifted back in her chair, the small confidence she had brought in with her already gone. She looked like someone who had walked into the wrong story and just now realized it. Emily closed the folder with a soft, final sound. Outside, traffic moved along the street below, indifferent and constant. Inside, Jason stared at the papers as if they had turned into a language he would never learn. And Emily, with one hand still resting on the folder, sat in the center of the silence he had made and no longer feared, because she was no longer the woman he had come here to unsettle. She was the one holding the map now. By the time the mediator asked them to review the next clause, the room had settled into a brittle quiet, the kind that made every small sound feel louder than it should have been. Pages whispered as they turned. A pen clicked once, then stopped. Emily kept her gaze on the document in front of her, the final agreement laid out in clean black type. Every line reviewed, every number checked, every signature block waiting like a trap Jason had not yet noticed was already closed around him. His new partner sat very still beside him, her earlier composure thinning by the second. She had arrived wearing confidence like perfume, bright and noticeable, but the room had not welcomed her with admiration. It had welcomed her with silence. And silence, Emily had learned, could be far more dangerous than outrage. The mediator adjusted his glasses and began to speak in the careful tone of a man who had already sensed the shift in the air. According to the revised terms, the marital property division reflects the full financial disclosure submitted yesterday. Jason's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, scanning the line again, his thumb dragging down the page as if he could force the words to change through sheer disbelief. They did not change. They only stayed where they were, precise and unshakable. Emily had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. Not in anger, in order, in spreadsheets, in tax records, in account statements, in quiet meetings held in offices with heavy glass doors and neutral art on the walls. While Jason had been busy performing certainty, she had been building proof. While he had assumed she would arrive emotionally unprepared, she had arrived fully documented. He looked up at her then, and for a brief second the confidence in his face gave way to something rougher, something closer to panic. "This is not what we discussed," he said, but his voice no longer carried the ease of a man used to being obeyed. Emily lifted her eyes slowly. There was no rush in her movement, no need to fill the room with emotion. "It is exactly what was filed," she said. "You signed the disclosure." The words landed with quiet force. Jason glanced toward his partner, as if she might rescue him with a smile, a suggestion, anything. But she had gone pale, her fingers now pressed tightly together in her lap. She understood enough to know that this was not a misunderstanding. This was consequence. The mediator continued, his tone still formal, but the room had already stopped hearing him as background. The only thing anyone could feel now was the edge of the reversal. Emily reached into the folder and set down one more page, then another. Each one was placed with measured care, the way someone might set stones into a foundation. "These are the final amendments," she said. "The ones your attorney approved last week." Jason stared at the pages, then at the mediator, then back at Emily. The shape of the trap finally appeared to him all at once. His plan had been simple. Bring the new partner. Break her composure. Watch her stumble. Make her feel small in front of witnesses. But he had forgotten a detail that mattered more than pride. Emily no longer needed his approval, and she no longer mistook humiliation for power. She folded her hands on top of the folder and waited while the room absorbed the truth. One signature had already shifted the balance. One clause had already changed the outcome. And Jason, for the first time in years, understood that he was not watching her lose. He was watching her leave, taking the entire future with her. By the time Jason stepped out into the hallway, the energy around the mediation room had already changed. He carried himself like a man trying to recover dignity before the doors even finished closing behind him. But the polished confidence he had worn into the building was thinning fast. Emily stayed inside for one more beat, her hand resting lightly on the folder, her expression unreadable as the mediator gathered the final pages. The air in the room felt lighter now, almost deceptively calm, as if the storm had passed without anyone hearing it arrive. Outside, Jason found his new partner waiting near the glass wall, her posture tight, her smile fixed in the brittle way of someone who had expected a different outcome. She had arrived dressed to be noticed, careful and crisp, with expensive heels that clicked softly against the marble floor and a handbag held too firmly at her side. Jason said something low enough that no one else could hear, but the look she gave him in return said enough. She had expected Emily to break. She had expected tears, hesitation, a cracked voice, some sign that the day still belonged to the old marriage they had come to exploit. Instead, Emily had sat there with her back straight and her answers precise, never giving them the reaction they came for. It was a kind of control Jason did not know how to fight. Not with charm, not with pressure, not with the quiet performance he had rehearsed so carefully. The mediator appeared a moment later with the final packet under her arm, and Jason turned back toward the room as if he might still salvage something from the hour. But when he looked through the doorway, he saw Emily standing by the table, one hand on the legal folder, her gaze already moving past him toward the future he no longer had access to. There was no triumph in her face, no need for it. The documents had already spoken. The signatures were already lined up. The property division stood exactly where her attorney had placed it, and the accounts they had tried to keep vague were now listed with brutal clarity. Jason had walked in thinking he would use his new relationship as a weapon, a public reminder that he had moved on while she had supposedly stayed behind. But the room had refused to play the role he assigned it. Every number, every clause, every quiet correction had turned his performance into something smaller, almost tragic. Emily did not glance at his partner. She did not ask for an explanation. She did not give him the satisfaction of hearing her voice shake. She simply took the pen, signed the final page, and slid it back across the table with the same calm care she used to place a cup on her morning desk. That was the moment Jason understood that humiliation only works on people who still need your approval. Emily did not need his anymore. She stood, collected her bag, and checked the room one last time as though confirming that nothing of hers had been left behind except the marriage itself. Then she looked at the mediator and said, "Thank you for your time." No emotion. No apology. No opening for argument. Jason watched her turn toward the door, and for one brief second the entire room seemed to hold its breath. His new partner shifted beside him, suddenly less certain, as Emily passed them both without stopping. She did not hurry. She did not slow down. She walked like someone who already knew where her life was going and had no interest in making room for what she had outgrown. By the time her heels crossed the threshold, the balance in that hallway had already settled in her favor. He had brought an audience expecting her to fold. Instead, they had watched her leave with everything that mattered. Emily did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room had already learned what quiet could do in her hands. Jason stood near the doorway with his jaw set hard, his new partner angled beside him like she had been placed there for display, all polished smiles and uneasy posture. But the atmosphere around them had changed. It no longer belonged to his performance. It belonged to the woman who had just signed away the version of the marriage he thought he could control. Emily kept her attention on the folder in front of her while the mediator reviewed the remaining language, each sentence measured, each pause deliberate. The black coffee on the side table had gone cold, untouched except for the faint ring left beneath the cup. Outside the glass walls, the city kept moving in its bright, indifferent rhythm. Inside, time had slowed to the pace of consequences. Jason tried to recover his footing with a laugh that never fully formed. He looked at the papers, then at Emily, as if searching for a crack in her composure, some old wound he could press with the right words. But she gave him nothing. No tremor, no flinch, no explanation. That was what unsettled him most. She had once argued until her voice cracked, once tried to make him understand what fairness looked like when everything had been tilted against her. Now she sat with straight shoulders and calm hands, listening as though the outcome had already been decided before he arrived. The mediator slid a final page across the table and asked for confirmation. Emily read it once, then twice, not because she doubted it, but because she respected the weight of what it meant. Her name sat beside the language like a claim reclaimed. A house, the retirement account, the brokerage transfer, the reimbursement clause tied to the business loan he had insisted on calling a favor. Even the small private apartment she had kept in her own name, the one Jason had mocked as unnecessary, was now written into the settlement as untouchable. He had spent years telling her that caution was weakness, that independence was fear, that trusting him was enough. And yet here she was, proving every one of those assumptions expensive. Jason cleared his throat, trying for authority and landing somewhere nearer to discomfort. "You really want to do this here?" he asked, as if the room itself had offended him. Emily lifted her eyes at last, and the glance was so steady that he looked away first. "This is where we finish it," she said. No anger, no triumph, just a clean edge of fact. The mediator adjusted the papers and turned to the final acknowledgement. Emily reached for the pen with the same calm precision she would have used to sign a lease, an invoice, a contract for something she understood and intended to keep. Her hand did not shake when she wrote her name. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be. One signature was enough to lock in the terms that would reshape everything Jason had assumed would remain within his reach. He had brought his new partner to witness her being cornered. Instead, they were watching the last door close behind him. The new partner glanced at Jason, then back at Emily, with the strained expression of someone realizing too late that she had been invited to the wrong kind of ending. Emily set the pen down gently and closed the folder with one hand. The soft sound of it shutting felt louder than any argument they had ever had. She stood, smoothed the front of her blazer, and looked toward the mediator. "Thank you," she said, her voice even and clear. Not cold, not cruel, just finished. Jason opened his mouth, perhaps to say her name, perhaps to object, perhaps to reach for some final word that might make the moment bend back in his favor. But the chance had passed. Emily lifted her bag, turned away from the table, and walked toward the door with the kind of composure that made the whole room straighten in response. She did not rush to make a statement. She did not glance back to confirm who was watching. She simply moved forward, carrying her future with a steadiness that left no room for doubt. By the time she reached the hallway, the papers behind her were no longer just paperwork. They were proof. And Jason, still standing under the harsh mediation lights with his new partner beside him, finally understood that he had not come to trigger her. He had come to watch her leave with everything. For a long moment after the mediator signed the last page, no one moved. The room held its breath in that strange, polished way expensive places did when something important had just ended and nobody knew who had truly won. The fountain outside the glass wall kept murmuring in the courtyard. A printer in the corner hummed softly, spitting out the final copies. Emily stood beside the table with her folder closed at her side, her expression calm enough to make the silence around her feel louder. Jason watched her as if he had only just discovered that the woman he once underestimated had become someone he could no longer reach. His new partner shifted near the doorway, her smile fixed in that brittle way that comes when confidence has started to crack. Nobody spoke first. Emily did not offer the room the mercy of explanation. She simply gathered her papers, one by one, aligning the edges with careful hands. The small, precise gesture had always belonged to her, but now it carried something else. Control, ownership, finality. The mediator cleared his throat and looked down at the agreement with professional detachment, though even he seemed aware that the atmosphere had changed for good. Jason tried to recover the shape of the room the way he always had before, with a half laugh, a lifted chin, the old habit of expecting everyone else to bend. But there was nothing left here that belonged to that version of him. Emily turned slightly, enough to acknowledge him without inviting him closer. Her eyes were steady, unreadable, and far too peaceful to feed on his discomfort. That was what unsettled him most. Not anger, not tears, not the trembling he had counted on. Just composure, clear and complete, like a glass surface with no ripples at all. She reached for her bag, slung the strap over her shoulder, and let her gaze settle for 1 second on the final stack of documents. Those pages were no longer only legal paper. They were the record of everything she had survived, everything she had rebuilt, and everything she had refused to surrender. Jason had brought his new partner to watch her shrink. Instead, they had watched her stand in the same room where he had once reduced her voice to a whisper and leave it as her own. He opened his mouth, maybe to say her name, maybe to ask for a softer ending, but the moment was already gone. Emily moved toward the door without haste, without hesitation, without the smallest glance backward for confirmation that he was still there. And that was the final cut. Not a dramatic speech, not a slammed door, just a woman walking out with her dignity intact, her future secured, and the last claim he had on her life sealed behind her in neat black ink. Outside the mediation suite, the hallway seemed brighter, the air lighter, as if the building itself had noticed the shift. Emily paused only once, near the window at the end of the corridor, where afternoon light warmed the marble floor. She looked down at the papers in her hand, then out at the city beyond the glass, and for the first time in years, the road ahead belonged entirely to her. Jason remained inside, staring at the empty chair she had left behind, finally understanding that he had not triggered her at all. He had delivered her to the finish line, and she had crossed it without him.